Gas prices officially hit an average of $5 per gallon nationwide this weekend, setting a new all-time record. As of this morning, prices at the pump are up over 50 cents a gallon from a week ago, and a whopping $2 a gallon from a year ago.
On Friday, President Biden called out oil and gas companies for exacerbating the gas crisis, telling reporters, quote, Exxon made more money than God this year. Let's watch.
We're going to make sure that everybody knows Exxon's profits. Why don't you tell them what Exxon's profits were this quarter? Exxon made more money than God this year. And by the way, nothing's changed. And they're not, by the way, one thing I want to say about the oil companies. They talk about how they have 9,000 permits to drill. They're not drilling. Why aren't they drilling? Because they make more money not producing more oil. The price goes up, number one. And number two, the reason they're not drilling is they're buying back their own stock, which should be taxed, quite frankly, buying back their own stock and making no new investments. So I always thought Republicans were for investment. Exxon, start investing, start paying your taxes. Thanks.
Joining us now to weigh in is Fadhel Kaboub. He's an associate professor of economics at Denison University and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
So what do you think about Biden's little soundbite there? Do you truly think that Exxon has more money than God and that they ought to be taxed accordingly?
Well, what's sort of embarrassing about hearing the president of the United States say something like that is it sounds like the average Joe down the street who's completely powerless and doesn't have the capacity to tax and regulate the abusive market power of corporate America. My question to the president is, what are you going to do about it? What's your party going to do about it? What's Congress going to do about it? It's not like this is surprising when we, allow corporations to dominate and to concentrate market power and to take advantage of a global economic crisis to price gouge. What do we expect? We get this. So it's sort of, as I said, embarrassing to hear the president of the most powerful country on the planet complain like he's the average citizen.
Yeah, I will say, I understand that there's not a lot or everything he can do unilaterally, but Joe Biden does have a tendency to get up on his pulpit and talk as though he's not like the manager of the country. It's always like, we need to do something about this. And it's like, you mean you?
Well, I'm curious.
And
so
also,
you attribute this to
put
price.
Things in,
Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. To put things in context, I mean, we're still 45%. We have 45% lower gas prices than European countries, Australia, other places, except we feel the pain, and the average person feels the pain more because we rely heavily on driving. We don't have resilient public transportation systems. We don't have social safety nets comparable to what people have in Australia and Europe. So we feel the pain even though prices are still much, much lower than other countries. So this speaks to the long-term kind of negligence that we have in this country in terms of the working class, the middle class, our transportation infrastructure, and so on.
I mean, some of that's due to the fact that the U.S. is astonishingly spread out, and so our system of transit is going to be fundamentally different than that of France. But I'm curious, you attribute some of this to price gouging, but not to perhaps the more obvious thing, which is inflation, as well as the sort of decline in number of oil rigs that currently are operating in the U.S. And then one thing that I always think about when considering this is the degree to which there was so much opposition toward the Keystone Pipeline and other things that would have delivered Canadian oil to the U.S. in a highly efficient manner. Obviously, construction on that has not finished, but this is something where there was significant political opposition that really hindered our ability to get that type of oil. Why are you attributing this to price gouging as opposed to all of these other factors at play?
So there's a couple of other long-term structural issues related to the energy sector that we need to pay attention to. So number one, we have to remember Hurricane Ida actually did quite a bit of disruption to the refining capacity of the United States. For example, in December of 2021, we had 40% less inventories in refineries in the US than a year earlier. Number two, you have the pandemic recovery, which added to demand right at the same time. And number three, we have the oil industry essentially using this opportunity to teach everybody a lesson that you can't live without us. You can't live without. So they reduced their investment in infrastructure to keep up with demand, not because they didn't have the financing, not because they didn't have the resources, but because they wanted to make up for the lost revenue of the last couple of years of the pandemic and use this to apply political pressure, specifically to get things like the pipelines approved by Congress to make sure that the public feels the pain and is left with no choice but to accept that climate activists are the problem, that those who protect the environment are the ones who are causing this pain at the pump. So we have to be cognizant of all of these issues. And then finally, of course, you can't neglect the fact that there was a global energy crisis before even the Ukraine conflict, before even the sanctions on Russia. We have to remember that China last year imposed brand new safety restrictions on coal mining that completely freaked out the coal mining industry in China. And many of them had to shut down because they feared the sanctions from the Chinese government. So that caused blackouts across China because the coal industry was paralyzed for a while. And that shifted China's demand to alternative fuels, oil and gas, and that drove energy prices up just because of the situation in China. And of course, you add the Ukraine crisis and the sanctions that followed, and you have global energy prices going through the roof and commodity prices going through the roof. So all of these factors explain the overall inflation. The supply chain disruptions obviously affect inflation across the board. So it's not just the Keystone Pipeline and kind of, this is the narrative of the oil and gas industry. They want to get their project done, and they use any opportunity to justify it, neglecting the fact that we have a global climate crisis that we need to deal with immediately, rather than wait until the pipeline is built and we have even more oil and gas infrastructure and more stranded assets to drive us faster towards the cliff when it comes to climate change.
I mean, reduced supply, like what you're talking about with the crisis in Ukraine and Russia, is absolutely a contributing factor in this. But like one of the ways to alleviate that reduced supply is via the Keystone Pipeline. But
But I do to his point, right?
It's not going to be an immediate relief either.
It's not going to be an immediate
Absolutely.
relief, and we do have this existed climate control. In the same way we see, a stall on the pipeline, we also see a stall on meaningful initiatives to address, climate control. So there is that. What do you want to see?
There are short-term solutions that we can introduce immediately to deal with the crisis without pipelines, because it's not like we actually have shortages. We don't have lines of people waiting at the gas station. There is actually gas. It's just more expensive. Right. So one of the things we can do is, temporarily at least remove federal gas taxes, state gas taxes. That's not, a massive relief. I mean, 18 cents a gallon for federal taxes in some states, up to 50 or 60 cents a gallon. That's a little bit of relief. But you can encourage more people to work remotely. You can encourage more people to take public transportation for free in some major cities.
Well, but if
you
we're
can
talking about
actually do something about this in the short term, and you can support the most vulnerable people with direct tax credits or relief checks to get to work if there's no other option. So the federal government does have solutions. Congress has solutions. President Biden has solutions. They just don't want to go that route.
And I do think in the long term, it does incentivize us investing in public transportation in these methods, because we would be in a different position, right? And obviously the people most feeling this hurt and this impact are working class people, lower class people, lower economic class people who feel this in their households. They feel this in the gas prices cutting into the amount of money they would spend on buying food and all these different things. So I do think it incentivizes us to invest in public transportation.
Americans are feeling the squeeze not just at the gas pump and the grocery store, though, but in the housing market as well. Redfin data finds that nationally listed rents for apartments have increased 15% from last year. The median rent for apartments on the market jumped above $2,000 a month for the first time. NPR reports that rent is up more than 30% in markets including Austin, Seattle, Cincinnati, and Nashville. What do you guys think about this, and how does inflation and the sort of situation that we've gotten into play into the pain that people are feeling in when it comes to housing prices?
Well, I live in New York City, so rent has been breaking my back for quite some time. And I've heard recently, I think our median rent has risen all the way to $4,000 in Manhattan, which is astronomical. So I think we're all feeling that.
The interesting thing is, though, the degree to which it's also affecting smaller cities where people are less accustomed to this. I mean, I split my time between Austin and New York, and it's been quite sad seeing the degree to which people have been driven out of Austin. But at the same time, we're also seeing housing supply being terribly constrained by terrible city regulations and incredibly long permitting processes. And it really doesn't appear to be alleviating soon. What do you think?
Well, when it comes to every inflation pressure point you can see in the U.S. economy, you can break it down into two categories. One is the shortage of productive capacity. That has to do with skilled labor, materials, inputs, so the disruptions to the global supply chain affect it. Energy prices will affect it. So that's one component. The good news about that component is that we can deal with it by investing strategically, not reducing spending, investing strategically to release more resources into that particular sector. But the second source of inflation pressure usually has to do with concentration of market power or abuse of market power, to be more specific. And that's certainly true in the real estate industry. And it has to do also with the financial industry concentration and the rental market over the last 10 years after the global financial crisis after 2008. So these are things that lawmakers can address with strategic investments. These are certainly not things that the Federal Reserve Bank will address by raising interest rates. How does raising the interest rate going to unclog the global supply chain? How does raising the interest rate going to end the conflict in the Ukraine? How does raising the interest rate going to address the abuse of market power in particular industries? So we have to recognize that the tools for addressing the root cause of inflation are actually in the hands of the 535 people we sent to Washington, D.C., a government of the people, by the people, for the people, like it's supposed to be, not by the super PACs for the super PACs. So we have to recognize that fundamentally we have an issue with the democratic process of who's in charge of providing relief to the American public. It's Congress.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our rising panel joins us next. Stay with us.